When Iraqi forces crossed the border into Iran in September 1980, the invasion appeared at first glance to be a conventional regional war born of territorial disputes and revolutionary upheaval. Yet, beneath the surface, it quickly became one of the Cold War's most complex and revealing proxy conflicts, because the Iran-Iraq War unfolded at the intersection of superpower rivalry, post-colonial state formation, ideological fear, and strategic calculation, transforming an 8-year bloodbath into a conflict that was shaped as much by external manipulation and selective support as by the decisions made in Tehran and Baghdad. And the origins of the war lay in the profound shock delivered to the global order by the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which overthrew a long-standing Western-aligned monarchy and replaced it with a theocratic state openly hostile to both American influence and Soviet-style communism, creating a political anomaly that unsettled every major power, because Iran was no longer a predictable Cold War client, but an unpredictable revolutionary force whose ideology rejected the legitimacy of both blocs. And this uncertainty created an opening that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein believed he could exploit, calculating that revolutionary Iran was internally fractured, militarily weakened, and diplomatically isolated, and that a swift war could secure territorial gains, regional prestige, and dominance over the Persian Gulf, particularly along the strategically vital Shatt al-Arab waterway, which had long been a source of tension between the two states. And yet Saddam's decision to invade was shaped not only by regional ambition, but by the broader Cold War environment, because Iraq, though officially non-aligned, had cultivated close ties with the Soviet Union, receiving weapons and diplomatic backing, while presenting itself as a secular bulwark against Islamist radicalism. A positioning that became increasingly valuable to both superpowers once Iran emerged as a revolutionary wildcard, and when the war began, it quickly became clear that neither Washington nor Moscow viewed it as a simple bilateral conflict, because the outcome would determine the balance of power in a region central to global energy supplies and Cold War strategy. And as Iraqi forces advanced into Iranian territory, the expectation in many foreign capitals was that the Islamic Republic would collapse under the combined pressures of invasion, internal purges, and economic disruption. Yet instead, Iran mobilized mass resistance, framing the war as a sacred defense of the revolution, and transforming what might have been a short campaign into a prolonged struggle fueled by ideology, sacrifice, and nationalist fervor. And this transformation altered the strategic calculus for external powers, because an Iranian defeat no longer seemed assured, while an Iranian victory threatened to export revolutionary ideology across the region, destabilizing U.S.-aligned Gulf monarchies and undermining Soviet influence among secular Arab regimes. And it was this fear, rather than any affection for Saddam Hussein, that drove the gradual convergence of Western and Eastern interests around the containment of Iran, producing one of the Cold War's most morally ambiguous alignments, in which ideological rivals found themselves tacitly aligned against a common threat. And as the war dragged on, the Soviet Union resumed large-scale arms deliveries to Iraq, despite initial hesitation, seeing Baghdad as the lesser of two risks, while the United States, still reeling from the hostage crisis and formally hostile to Tehran, moved from neutrality toward quiet support for Iraq, facilitating intelligence sharing, financial assistance through regional allies, and diplomatic cover that allowed the conflict to continue without decisive intervention. And this external support mattered because it enabled Iraq to sustain a war effort far beyond its domestic capacity, while Iran, isolated and sanctioned, was forced to rely on improvisation, internal mobilization, and clandestine procurement networks to replace lost equipment, and this asymmetry transformed the battlefield into a grinding war of attrition marked by trench warfare, human wave assaults, and catastrophic casualties, echoing earlier industrial wars while unfolding under the shadow of nuclear-armed superpowers. And as casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, the conflict revealed the darker mechanics of Cold War proxy warfare, where external actors did not seek victory or peace, but balance, prolonging violence to prevent either side from achieving decisive success. And this logic became especially evident as chemical weapons were introduced on a large scale by Iraqi forces, a development known to foreign governments, yet met with muted response. Because condemning or halting their use risked weakening a partner deemed strategically necessary. And in this silence, the war exposed the limits of Cold War. Moral rhetoric, demonstrating how principles of international law were subordinated to containment when strategic priorities demanded it. And within Iran, the war consolidated the revolutionary regime, allowing leaders to suppress dissent, militarize society, and frame internal opposition as treason in the face of existential threat. While in Iraq, the conflict justified the expansion of state repression and the personalization of power around Saddam Hussein, reinforcing a system that would later destabilize the region in new and destructive ways. And as the front lines stagnated and the war expanded into the Persian Gulf through tanker attacks and naval incidents, the conflict drew in external military forces more directly, threatening global shipping lanes and energy markets, and forcing the United States to increase its presence under the banner of protecting neutrality while effectively shielding Iraq's war effort, further blurring the line between proxy and participant. And by the mid-1980s, it was evident that the Iran-Iraq War had become a Cold War conflict in function, if not in name, shaped by superpower fears, sustained by external support, and prolonged by a strategic preference for stalemate over resolution. And yet, despite its scale and brutality, the war remained officially peripheral to Cold War narratives focused on Europe and nuclear rivalry, a contradiction that underscored how the most destructive proxy conflicts were often those fought far from the central theaters of ideological confrontation, where human costs could be absorbed without triggering superpower accountability. And as the war ground on toward its eventual ceasefire in 1988, it left behind not a victor, but a devastated region, hardened regimes, and unresolved grievances, demonstrating that the Cold War's influence was not confined to ideological alignment, but extended into the structure, duration, and outcome of wars that reshaped entire societies while serving the strategic imperatives of distant powers. As the conflict settled into a brutal stalemate after the initial invasion failed to topple the Islamic Republic, the Iran-Iraq War entered a phase defined by endurance rather than maneuver, revealing how Cold War proxy dynamics rewarded persistence and punished compromise, because once Iran halted and then reversed Iraqi advances in 1981, reclaiming much of its lost territory, the war ceased to be about borders and became a struggle over legitimacy, survival, and regional order. And within Tehran, the leadership under Ruhollah Khomeini rejected calls for negotiation, framing continued combat as a religious and revolutionary obligation until Saddam Hussein was removed from power, a position that alarmed both superpowers. Because the collapse of the Iraqi state threatened to create a power vacuum across the Arab world that revolutionary Iran could exploit, and this fear translated into a quiet but decisive shift in external behavior, as diplomatic, financial, and military channels increasingly favored Iraq's ability to sustain resistance rather than achieve victory. And this preference for balance manifested in the steady flow of weapons, credits, and political support that insulated Baghdad from the consequences of battlefield losses, while Iran's isolation deepened through sanctions and arms embargoes that forced it into costly improvisation. And this imbalance hardened the war into a grinding contest of attrition in which human life became a substitute for technological parity, most visibly in Iran's use of mass infantry assaults designed to overwhelm fortified Iraqi positions, tactics that produced staggering casualties while reinforcing a culture of martyrdom that bound society more tightly to the state. And on the Iraqi side, the regime responded by escalating its reliance on firepower and repression, expanding the use of artillery, air power, and eventually chemical weapons to blunt Iranian advances, calculating that external tolerance would persist so long as these measures prevented Iranian victory. And this calculation proved largely correct, because international responses to chemical attacks were muted, constrained by the logic that condemning Iraq too forcefully might tilt the balance toward Iran, a silence that revealed how Cold War priorities distorted enforcement of international norms. And as the war dragged on, both societies were transformed by militarization, as economies were redirected toward survival. Dissent was suppressed under the pretext of national emergency, and political authority became inseparable from the conduct of war, creating feedback loops in which continued conflict justified continued repression, and beyond the front lines, the war's expansion into the Persian Gulf exposed its global implications, as attacks on oil tankers and shipping lanes threatened energy supplies and drew in foreign naval forces under the banner of protection, further entangling external powers in a conflict they claimed to be observing from a distance. And this escalation underscored the paradox of the war's proxy status, because while neither superpower sought direct confrontation, both were willing to tolerate escalating violence so long as it preserved a strategic stalemate. And by the mid-1980s, the Iran-Iraq War had become a war without exit, sustained by fear of the alternatives rather than belief in victory, a condition that exemplified the Cold War's darker logic, where prolonged suffering was preferable to unpredictable change, and as casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands and economic devastation spread across both countries, the conflict demonstrated how proxy wars could become self-perpetuating systems, driven by internal dynamics but stabilized by external interests, ensuring that peace remained elusive even as exhaustion set in. And it was within this context of deadlock and devastation that the war's later phases would unfold, marked by increasing international involvement, rising desperation, and decisions that would further entrench the conflict's legacy long after the shooting stopped. As the war moved deeper into the mid-1980s, the Iran-Iraq conflict expanded beyond trenches and border towns into a broader regional and international crisis, exposing how Cold War proxy warfare could metastasize when stalemate became policy, because with neither side able to achieve decisive victory and external powers unwilling to impose peace, the battlefield widened to include cities, economies, and global shipping routes, transforming the conflict into a total war that punished civilians as much as soldiers. And it was during this phase that both regimes escalated deliberately, not out of confidence, but out of desperation, as missile attacks on urban centers inaugurated what became known as the War of the Cities, a campaign of terror designed to break civilian morale and demonstrate resolve to both domestic audiences and foreign patrons. And these attacks revealed how the logic of proxy warfare eroded restraints, because when victory was unattainable and compromise unacceptable, suffering itself became a strategic instrument, and external actors, while publicly calling for de-escalation, privately calculated that mutual exhaustion served their interests better than intervention. And this calculation was particularly visible in the Persian Gulf, where the so-called tanker war emerged as a direct consequence of stalemate on land, as both sides sought to strangle the other's economic lifelines by attacking oil exports, drawing neutral shipping into the conflict, and threatening the stability of global energy markets. And it was here that the United States moved from indirect involvement to a more overt military presence, escorting tankers and engaging in naval skirmishes under the justification of protecting freedom of navigation, a posture that nominally maintained neutrality, but in practice disproportionately shielded Iraq's export capacity while Iran bore the brunt of isolation and retaliation, further entrenching the perception in Tehran that the war was no longer simply against Baghdad, but against an international system aligned to contain the revolution. And this perception reinforced Iran's refusal to compromise, because acceptance of a ceasefire under such conditions would be framed internally as surrender to foreign pressure rather than a negotiated settlement. And as the war intensified, the role of external suppliers became even more pronounced, with Iraq benefiting from a diverse network of arms sources spanning Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and regional allies, while Iran relied increasingly on clandestine procurement, black markets, and limited channels that exposed it to exploitation and strategic vulnerability. And this asymmetry reinforced the proxy nature of the conflict, because Iraq's capacity to sustain mechanized warfare depended directly on external tolerance and support, while Iran's endurance depended on ideological mobilization and human sacrifice, creating two distinct war economies shaped by Cold War alignments rather than purely national capacity. And as chemical weapons use expanded, particularly against Iranian forces and later against civilian populations, the war crossed thresholds that had been taboo since the First World War. Yet, international reaction remained constrained by geopolitical calculation, revealing how Cold War proxy logic could neutralize moral outrage when accountability threatened strategic balance. And this silence carried long-term consequences, not only for the victims, but for the norms governing warfare, because it signaled that certain violations would be tolerated if committed by actors deemed strategically useful, a message that would echo in later conflicts. And within both Iran and Iraq, the prolonged war reshaped political culture as emergency governance became normalized and institutions adapted to perpetual conflict, entrenching militarized elites and narrowing the space for dissent. And in Iraq, this consolidation of power around Saddam Hussein created a regime whose survival was inseparable from coercion and spectacle. While in Iran, the war strengthened revolutionary institutions that claimed legitimacy through sacrifice and resistance, embedding the conflict into national identity in ways that would persist long after the ceasefire. And as the human cost climbed into the millions of dead, wounded, and displaced, the war exposed the structural cruelty of proxy conflict, where external actors could influence duration and intensity without bearing responsibility for outcome. And by the late 1980s, exhaustion began to override ideology, as economic collapse, battlefield attrition, and shifting international priorities reduced tolerance for endless war, setting the stage for a ceasefire that would end active combat without resolving the underlying grievances, leaving both regimes intact but societies deeply scarred. And in this sense, the Iran-Iraq War exemplified the Cold War's capacity to prolong violence through balance rather than resolution, producing not winners but survivors, and demonstrating that proxy wars were often less about achieving objectives than about preventing change. A dynamic that ensured the war's legacy would be measured not in territory gained or lost, but in the enduring instability and resentment it left behind, shaping regional politics long after the superpowers that had helped sustain the conflict began to withdraw their attention. As exhaustion finally began to eclipse ideology in the late 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War entered its terminal phase. revealing how Cold War proxy conflicts often ended not through decisive victory or reconciliation, but through collapse, attrition, and external recalibration. Because by this stage, both Iran and Iraq were economically shattered, militarily depleted, and socially traumatized. Yet neither regime could easily abandon the war without undermining its own legitimacy, having framed continued sacrifice as proof of national survival. And it was only when the international environment shifted decisively that an exit became possible, as external powers that had once tolerated stalemate grew increasingly alarmed by the war's destabilizing spillover, particularly in the Persian Gulf, where repeated naval incidents, accidental engagements, and the risk of escalation with foreign forces threatened to draw the superpowers into direct confrontation, a scenario that the late Cold War's fragile equilibrium could not absorb. And at the same time, Iraq, emboldened by renewed external backing and battlefield momentum, launched a series of offensives in 1988 that reversed years of Iranian gains, using overwhelming firepower, improved coordination, and continued chemical attacks to break Iranian defenses, signaling to Tehran that the cost of continued resistance was rising faster than any conceivable reward. And within Iran, this military pressure coincided with profound internal strain, as years of mobilization had drained manpower, eroded infrastructure, and generated quiet war weariness even among populations once committed to revolutionary sacrifice, forcing the leadership to confront a reality it had long resisted. That continuation of the war now threatened the survival of the state it was meant to defend, and it was under these conditions that Iran accepted a United Nations brokered ceasefire in 1988, a decision publicly framed as a bitter but necessary concession, ending 8 years of fighting without resolving the political antagonism that had fueled the conflict. And this ending captured the essential nature of the war as a Cold War proxy, because the ceasefire preserved both regimes, satisfied the strategic preference of external powers for containment over transformation, and froze underlying hostilities, rather than addressing them, leaving borders largely unchanged and grievances intact. And in the aftermath, both societies were left to reckon with losses that defied comprehension, as entire generations had been consumed by a conflict that produced no clear gains, while leaders who had prosecuted the war emerged politically strengthened by having survived it, a pattern characteristic of proxy wars where endurance itself becomes a claim to legitimacy. And regionally, the war's conclusion did not bring stability, but reset the conditions for future crises, as Iraq's massive debts, militarized economy, and inflated sense of regional entitlement set the stage for new confrontations, while Iran's revolutionary state emerged more centralized, more suspicious, and more deeply defined by resistance to external pressure. And from a Cold War perspective, the war's end underscored how proxy conflicts could conclude quietly, despite their scale, slipping out of global attention once they ceased to threaten superpower equilibrium, even as their consequences continued to shape regional politics, security doctrines, and international norms, particularly regarding the use of force and the tolerance of atrocities. And in this sense, the Iran-Iraq War closed not with resolution, but with exhaustion, demonstrating how the Cold War's influence lay not only in starting wars, but in structuring how and when they could end, ensuring that peace arrived not as reconciliation, but as a pause imposed by limits reached rather than lessons learned. In the years immediately following the ceasefire, the true nature of the Iran-Iraq War as a Cold War proxy became clearer, because the absence of a decisive outcome revealed that the conflict had functioned less as a struggle for victory than as a mechanism for containment, shaped by external tolerance for prolonged violence, so long as it prevented either side from reshaping the regional order. And this reality was reflected in how quickly international attention shifted elsewhere once the guns fell silent, leaving Iran and Iraq to absorb the social, economic, and psychological devastation largely on their own, even as the structures that had sustained the war remained intact. And in Iraq, the regime emerged militarily hardened, but economically crippled, burdened by immense debt and a political culture that equated survival with aggression, a condition that would soon drive Baghdad toward new confrontations, as Saddam Hussein sought to translate wartime endurance into post-war dominance. While in Iran, the leadership consolidated power around institutions forged in conflict, embedding the narrative of sacrifice and resistance into national identity, and using the memory of external hostility to justify continued militarization and internal control. And this divergence underscored how proxy wars could strengthen regimes regardless of outcome, because endurance itself became proof of legitimacy in systems where survival was framed as victory. And from a Cold War perspective, this was a perverse success, as the primary objective of preventing radical change in the balance of power had been achieved at extraordinary human cost, while the deeper sources of instability were merely deferred, and the war's legacy thus extended far beyond its battlefield, influencing how both states approached diplomacy, security, and internal dissent in the years that followed, and shaping regional perceptions of international law, because the muted response to chemical weapons use and civilian targeting reinforced a belief that norms were selectively enforced, undermining confidence in global institutions and encouraging future violations. And as scholars later reassessed the conflict, they increasingly recognized it as emblematic of the Cold War's darker dynamics, where wars on the periphery could be prolonged indefinitely because their resolution mattered less than their containment. And this recognition challenges narratives that frame the era primarily through superpower diplomacy and nuclear standoffs, because it reveals how the Cold War's most destructive consequences were often borne by societies far from the central theaters of rivalry, whose suffering was normalized as a byproduct of stability elsewhere. And in this sense, the Iran-Iraq War stands as a stark reminder that proxy conflicts were not accidents or side effects, but integral components of Cold War strategy, shaping outcomes through omission as much as intervention, and leaving behind political orders defined by trauma, suspicion, and militarization, conditions that would continue to influence Middle Eastern geopolitics long after the Cold War itself had ended, demonstrating that the war's significance lay not in its immediate results, but in the enduring patterns it reinforced. Patterns in which prolonged violence became acceptable so long as it served the imperatives of balance, and peace arrived only when exhaustion aligned with external recalculation rather than genuine reconciliation. As the Cold War itself began to loosen in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Iran-Iraq War came to be understood not as an aberration, but as a concentrated expression of how superpower rivalry had reshaped regional conflicts into instruments of strategic management. Because the war's endurance demonstrated that external actors could influence outcomes not only by intervening directly, but by deciding when not to intervene, allowing violence to continue until it produced a balance deemed acceptable. And this logic was evident in how the conflict was framed retrospectively as a tragic but contained episode, rather than a systemic failure of international governance, a framing that obscured the degree to which the war had been enabled by arms transfers, diplomatic shielding, and selective silence. And for the societies that had endured it, this reinterpretation offered little solace because the physical destruction, demographic loss, and psychological scars remained embedded in everyday life, shaping attitudes toward authority, sacrifice, and external power. And within Iran, the war's memory became institutionalized as proof that survival depended on self-reliance and vigilance against foreign manipulation, reinforcing a political culture that equated compromise with vulnerability. While in Iraq, the experience normalized militarism and repression, creating a state whose post-war trajectory was defined by unresolved aggression and economic desperation, conditions that would soon erupt into new crises once Cold War constraints loosened. And this divergence revealed how proxy wars could generate asymmetric legacies even when they ended in stalemate, because the internal narratives forged through conflict shaped future behavior in ways external powers could neither predict nor control. And from a broader historical perspective, the war challenges simplified narratives of Cold War containment by illustrating how stability at the global level was often purchased through instability at the regional level, a trade-off that was rarely acknowledged explicitly but consistently practiced. And this trade-off undermined the legitimacy of international norms, because repeated tolerance of atrocities signaled that enforcement depended on strategic alignment rather than principle. Weakening the moral authority of institutions meant to regulate conflict, and as the Cold War ended and new forms of rivalry emerged, the Iran-Iraq War remained a reference point for understanding how prolonged violence could be sustained through external calculation rather than internal necessity, serving as a cautionary example of how wars can become self-perpetuating systems when resolution threatens interests beyond the battlefield. And in this sense, the conflict's legacy is inseparable from the Cold War that shaped it, because it revealed the era's capacity to absorb immense human suffering without triggering decisive intervention, and to end wars not when justice was achieved, but when exhaustion aligned with shifting priorities, leaving behind societies tasked with rebuilding amid memories of sacrifice that had been demanded in the name of causes ultimately subordinated to balance. And as historians continue to reassess the Cold War's impact on the Middle East, the Iran-Iraq War stands as one of its most consequential and least resolved chapters, demonstrating how proxy warfare could devastate entire generations while remaining marginal in the narratives of the powers that helped sustain it. In retrospect, the Iran-Iraq War reveals with stark clarity how the Cold War's logic could convert regional disputes into prolonged catastrophes by prioritizing equilibrium over resolution, because the conflict was never allowed to end when compromise was possible, but only when exhaustion became unavoidable. And this delay was not accidental, but embedded in a strategic environment where neither superpower wished to see transformative victory by either side, preferring instead a grinding balance that neutralized a revolutionary threat while avoiding direct confrontation. And this preference shaped every stage of the war, from the tolerance of massive arms transfers to the muted response to chemical warfare and civilian targeting, signaling that the enforcement of norms was contingent on alignment rather than conduct. And for Iran and Iraq, this contingency produced political systems hardened by trauma, where survival through sacrifice became the central claim to legitimacy, narrowing the space for dissent and embedding militarization into national identity. And this embedding mattered because it carried the war's influence forward into peacetime, shaping how both states interpreted security, diplomacy, and internal opposition long after the ceasefire. And regionally, the conflict left a landscape destabilized not only by destruction, but by precedent, because it demonstrated that prolonged violence could unfold under international supervision without decisive intervention, encouraging future actors to believe that escalation might be tolerated if framed as necessary to balance. And this belief would resurface in later crises as Cold War constraints dissolved and new rivalries emerged, And from a historical standpoint, the war thus stands as an indictment of proxy warfare, as a tool of stability, revealing how it externalized risk onto societies deemed peripheral while insulating decision-makers from immediate cost. And this externalization explains why the war's human toll failed to trigger meaningful accountability at the time, because the suffering occurred outside the central theaters of superpower competition, where escalation thresholds were defined more by strategic calculus than by humanitarian concern. And as scholars reassessed the Cold War's peripheral wars, they increasingly recognized the Iran-Iraq conflict as emblematic of an era in which endurance replaced justice as the measure of success, and where peace arrived not through reconciliation, but through depletion, leaving behind unresolved grievances that would shape Middle Eastern politics for decades. And in this sense, the war's legacy cannot be separated from the Cold War itself, because it exposes the structural incentives that prolonged violence while constraining change, demonstrating that the era's most devastating conflicts were often those managed most carefully, their outcomes calibrated not for peace, but for balance. And as the Cold War faded into history, the Iran-Iraq War remained as a reminder that proxy conflicts did not merely reflect superpower rivalry, but were constitutive of it, shaping global order through the suffering of societies whose wars were allowed to continue precisely because their resolution threatened the stability of a system built on fear, rivalry, and the avoidance of decisive change. The final assessment, the Iran-Iraq War, stands as one of the Cold War's most devastating demonstrations of how proxy conflict could become an end in itself, sustained not by hope of victory, but by fear of transformation, because the war's continuation served the strategic comfort of external powers more than the interests of the societies fighting it. And this comfort was purchased through tolerance of destruction, on a scale that would have been unthinkable in the Cold War's central theaters, revealing a hierarchy of concern in which some regions absorbed violence so others could remain stable. And this hierarchy shaped the war's every phase, from the permissive flow of weapons to the silence surrounding chemical attacks, embedding a lesson that power, not principle, determined accountability. And for Iran and Iraq, this lesson had lasting consequences, as both states emerged traumatized and militarized, their political systems reinforced by narratives of survival that justified repression and discouraged reconciliation, ensuring that peace would be shallow and provisional rather than transformative. And regionally, the war reset expectations about conflict, normalizing prolonged violence and eroding confidence in international mediation, because the experience demonstrated that even the most catastrophic wars could be managed rather than resolved if they served broader strategic equilibrium. And this management left behind a legacy of mistrust toward global institutions that had failed to intervene decisively, shaping regional attitudes toward diplomacy and security for decades. And from a historical perspective, the conflict forces a reevaluation of Cold War success, because if stability was achieved through the systematic deferral of justice and the acceptance of mass suffering, then the metric of victory becomes morally and analytically hollow. And the Iran-Iraq War thus occupies a central place in understanding the Cold War's true cost, not as a peripheral tragedy, but as a core expression of how the era functioned beyond Europe and nuclear brinkmanship, showing that the Cold War was sustained as much by what it allowed to happen as by what it prevented, and that its legacy cannot be measured solely in treaties signed or wars avoided, but in the lives consumed by conflicts whose prolongation was deemed acceptable so long as balance was preserved. And it is in this unresolved legacy that the war continues to echo, shaping regional politics and global perceptions long after the superpowers that once calibrated its duration have receded, leaving behind a cautionary record of how proxy warfare, when treated as a tool of stability, can devastate entire generations while appearing, from a distance, to have served its purpose. In closing, the Iran-Iraq War exposes the Cold War at its most brutal and most revealing, because it shows how global rivalry could transform a regional conflict into an 8-year catastrophe by rewarding endurance over resolution and balance over justice. And what makes the war uniquely instructive is not only its scale of destruction, but the fact that it unfolded with full awareness of the world's major powers, whose actions and silences shaped its duration without ever owning its consequences, allowing millions to die, societies to be militarized, and norms against chemical warfare and civilian targeting to erode in plain sight. And this erosion mattered because it demonstrated that in the Cold War order, rules were not enforced universally, but selectively, subordinated to strategic calculation, teaching states that survival and alignment mattered more than law or morality. And for Iran and Iraq, this lesson became embedded in political identity, as sacrifice was elevated to legitimacy and survival, became indistinguishable from victory, narrowing the possibility of reconciliation even after the guns fell silent. And regionally, the war left behind a Middle East more unstable, more suspicious, and more prone to future conflict, because the structures that had sustained the war, militarized states, unresolved grievances, and distrust of international mediation, remained intact, ready to be activated again under new conditions. And, from a historical perspective, the conflict stands as a definitive example of how proxy wars functioned not as side effects of the Cold War, but as core mechanisms of it, absorbing violence that could not be tolerated in the central theaters while preserving a global balance built on fear of decisive change. And this mechanism ensured that peace arrived only when exhaustion aligned with shifting external priorities, not when justice or settlement was achieved, leaving societies to carry the long-term costs alone. And in this sense, the Iran-Iraq War cannot be understood simply as a tragic regional struggle, but as a mirror held up to the Cold War itself, reflecting an international system willing to sustain immense human suffering so long as strategic equilibrium was maintained. And as the Cold War faded, the war's legacy remained, embedded in regional politics and global memory as a warning that proxy conflicts, once unleashed and managed rather than resolved, do not end cleanly, but continue to shape the world long after the powers that enabled them have moved on, leaving behind scars that no ceasefire can fully heal.